brainwaves actually do something important within the brain, or are they just side effects of other activities within the brain? Some scientists think that these brainwaves help the brain work, while others think that they are just noise. In this particular paper, the authors explain that it's important to separate what we measure, like brainwaves, from what's actually happening in the brain cells. They also say that even if brainwaves don't directly cause things to happen, they can still carry useful information within the brain. In the end, they argue that the brainwaves and the electrical fields within the brain that they create do play a meaningful role in how the brain processes. This paper addresses the debate over whether the brain waves or brain oscillations are truly functional in neural computation or merely byproducts of other neural processes. The authors of this paper clarify the distinction between brain signals and the underlying neural processes and propose a new vocabulary to better define this relationship. They argue that the electrical fields, including brainwaves, can have causal and computational roles, and that even if field potentials of the neurons don't directly cause neural events, they can still carry meaningful information. Overall, this paper supports the idea that neural oscillations and the electrical fields are relevant to brain function and that they are just not a noise. With that, let's get into this. There are two main perspectives when it comes to neural oscillation and brainwaves. Neuroscientists have long observed that aggregated neurosignals measured via EEG and MEG and LFP recordings show regular functions at characteristics frequencies. The presence and the characteristics of these neural oscillation correlate with various aspects of cognition and behavior, suggesting that they have a causal role in neural information processing. This hypothesis has given rise to the view that neural oscillations act as coordinates or the orchestrations of brain activities in scientific practices. It's important to distinguish between measurements and processes. Process refers to physical objects and events in the world, which are the targets of our investigations. But measurements refer to the signals or recordings we use to capture information about such objects or events. Examples of processes in neuroscience are neurobiological events across spatio-temporal scales, including action potential of the neurons, molecular cascades, and other dynamic interactions between neural structures occurring from the molecular scale to the scale of anatomical regions within the brain. Furthermore, behaviors such as motor activity are also physical processes with possible causal. On the other hand, measurements qualitatively and quantitatively capture processes with the goal of generating scientific inferences about those processes. Here, we use measurement in its noun form rather than as a verb, which refers to the act of measurement itself. While one might argue that measurements are themselves processes, they are privileged from the perspective of scientific investigation in that they are processes designed and used for inference about other processes rather than being object of study themselves. Regardless of the causal role of electrical fields in oscillation processes, the scientists argue that a key question in neuroscience is what role, if any, oscillation in process across levels of organization have in neural computation. Under the causal stance with regard to neural computation, oscillations, aka these waves, electrical waves, are considered as an intertwined set of neurobiological processes serve as an active coordinating function to information exchange across populations of neurons within the brain. Under the non-causal stance, even if oscillations reflect a mode of brain activity that correlates with cognition, oscillations are not granted processing capacities required to influence human cognition. These stances subtly differ from the range of positions one might have on the causal status of electrical fields in the brain. Specifically, one can hold the selective view that electrical fields in the brain are causally important for some homeostatic or other biological functions, while rejecting the oscillation in process, electrical field or otherwise, have a causal role in the mechanisms of neural computations underlying the human. In conclusion, these scientists mean that it's healthy to have different terminology when talking about brain waves and oscillation and electrical activities within the brain, but still the scientists need to have one terminology where they use so that they don't talk past each other. For example, they say if one party conceives of LFPs, local field potential, as electrical fields generated locally in confined circuits of the brain, while another views them as an undetermined signal with undoubtedly many processes underpinning it, then disputes over the relevance of LFPs or what research avenues are worth pursuing become misdirected from the outset. In a similar vein, they claim that oscillations are important to be part of our vocabulary, whether there's concerns that oscillation are processes, signals, or if they are both processes and signals, and whether oscillations are informative despite their causal effects, which other processes that they are informative towards. These researchers also argue that neuroscience may benefit from distinguishing measurements and processes on the one hand and information and causality on the other hand. They propose that these axes of analysis unclutter terminology, vagueness, and orient debates toward experimental validation, and that we need to adopt this lens to offer more empirically driven answers on the causal and inferential role of processes and measurements in electrophysiological measurements such as EEG. For example, LFPs, or local field potentials, are measurements that reveal direct information about the electrical field within the brain, as well as indirect information about the neurobiological processes, cognition, and human behavior. Many of these processes have causal relations between one another, although the evidence varies on a case-by-case basis. Perhaps most centrally, electrical fields likely influence neural processing over and above being produced by it through ephaptic coupling. Furthermore, they discuss that Oscillations or brainwaves are best cast as separate entity that can arise in processes and measurements. In this context, oscillations in processes across levels of scale appear to introduce a neural syntax by which multiplexed computation is enabled within the human cognition. However, not all measured neural activity is oscillatory, meaning to say wave-like, and neither does the presence of an oscillation in one entity necessitate oscillations in the other, meaning it is instructive to clarify what is oscillating when referring to neural processes and neural signals. And so these type of discussions are extremely healthy in that it makes us take a step back and refine and rethink the way in which we define various entities within our research practices, in this case neuroscience. While it may sound confusing and maybe too complex, it's always very important to do this sort of reflection, namely because once we start with any type of research in any field or in any subject matter for that matter, is that we start evolving and expanding and expanding the thoughts in terms of how we do things. But there always comes a point where we realize that maybe we've expanded too much and we kind of lost the vision as to how do we define everything, how do we make sure that we use the same type of language and the same type of definition such that when we argue or discuss or write papers, we're all on the same page essentially. And essentially this is what this paper is referring to. And the reason is this is healthy is because after that expansion, there always needs to be a convergence. And that is when you take a pause, you look at what you have found, and then you need to step back and converge everything and come up with a way in which you can maybe kind of start over, but you're really not starting over because you're starting over based on the previous findings that you've made maybe in the past few decades. And so that is why these researchers are also sort of stepping back a little bit, taking a breather and trying to redefine some of the terminologies we use in terms of oscillation, measurement, neural processing, and so forth, based on what we have learned in the past decades. I'll include the link to this paper below, as always, and that's all I had for today. Hope you liked it. Please make sure to share, like, and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It will increase the engagement. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.